Greetings, chess friends. International Master David Pruess here for ChessDojo, and today I'm very happy to begin working on a series of videos on my best or greatest games from my own chess playing career. Obviously, this is not going to be, like a game collection of a top grandmaster or anything like that. But I have played chess in part as an artist, and the games I'm going to show you are games which gave me, creative and aesthetic pleasure and satisfaction. And I hope they will provide the same to you, and that my explanations along the way will provide some instructional value as well, and perhaps a little bit of entertainment here and there if I'm able to get you into some of the scenes where these games were played. Now, Kostya, Jesse, and special guest Sam Shankland did a episode where they talked about my best games and sort of ranked them, and so I'm going to be doing these games in the order of their rankings, starting with number 10 and working my way gradually up to their number 1. Strange and shocking as it is to me, which games they picked as their top 1, 2, 3, even 4 games. And then, as a bonus, I will probably cover a couple games of mine that I like even better, which they did not rank highly. And of course, you'll be able to judge for yourselves how you rank any of these games. If you want to argue about the rankings, you can go to that. You can go to that ranking video and argue over there. And here, feel free to ask me any questions about, the game in question here, and I'll be happy to provide further explanations in the comments section. So let us get into the first game here. This one here is played at Capelle Le Grand, and a fair number, or a handful of my very best games were all played at Capelle Le Grand in 2 different years. I think I played there maybe in 2007 and 2008 or something like that, or 2009. No, definitely not 2009. Maybe 2006, 2007, 2008, somewhere in those years. And I had a pretty good outing each year. I really enjoyed being there, even though it was freezing cold in February on the northern coast of France. The second time I was there, we stayed in Dunkirk, where we could literally see the channel from the hotel. And each time I went and played in Capelle, I had friends with me, like my high school chess teammate Ricky, and various long-term training partners and buddies like Vinay Bhatt, Josh Friedel, Jesse Cry. So we were a fun crew, and we had a lot of fun at that tournament both times around. I think that's also where we met Jan Ludwig Hammer. I think we met him first when he came to visit our chess club to play a tournament, but he was there when we went, so it was a second time we hooked up with him and became closer friends through that tournament. So anyway, this game is from my slightly less successful Capelle tournament, a tournament in which I did not make a GM norm, but I think I still had, a very good score in this tournament and some nice games. It is a very, very classic Najdorf Sicilian. So anybody who's interested in playing the Najdorf, this is a pretty useful and instructive model game. So here's the Najdorf Sicilian, black mainly wants to be able to play e5 without allowing knight to b5 or bishop to b5 check, either of which moves would hurt black's ability to control the light squares on d5 and f5 after e5. But here, as you're going to see in this game, if after e5, the white knight has to move to a square far away from d5 and f5, and white doesn't have bishop b5 check trading black's light squared bishop, then sure, there are potential problems on the d5 and f5 squares, and you'll see in this game my opponent aiming for those squares, but it's not impossible for black to defend against those problems, right? Okay, so we'll back up one move. Bishop e3, often thought of as the English attack, which goes with f3 and g4, but that is not how my opponent played it. So when you play 6 bishop e3 and e5, the two most common retreats for white are knight b3 and knight f3, and which one they choose actually changes the game dramatically. So if somebody plays knight b3, of course there's still sidelines there, but they are potentially heading towards the main lines with an f3, g4 English attack and castling queenside. If, however, white plays knight f3, they're playing a more lame positional approach. I have trouble calling it a positional approach because the knight placement on f3 is not like positional or not quite correctly positional. Because the knight is in bad relation to this d6, e5 pawn center, and you'll see that white pretty much always wants to rearrange it later. I think perhaps the reason the knight goes to f3 in this approach is white is going to, well, white's dream is to play bishop c4 next move to get control of d5 nicely, and I guess the knight f3 is dissuading black from playing bishop e6 in view of knight to g5 going after that bishop and then weakening black's light squares. So maybe that's one of the main reasons the knight is on this somewhat random square. Also, you can imagine if the knight went to b3, the move bishop c4 would not be as clearly good because it wouldn't have a retreat, right? So I interpret this position as white's main next idea is to play bishop c4, and they're going to want to play for, some piece maneuvers and control over d5. The knight is blocking the move f4. g4 is not in the air either because that square is completely undefended. So it looks like they're not going for any quick pawn thrusts, but rather some piece maneuvers. And to my mind, queen c7 is the logical move for black, preventing bishop to c4. And that is what I have tended to play in this position throughout my career. My opponent here played an unusual move, which is the two-step with this bishop. I wasn't prepared for this. The move that I generally expect in this position as black is a4. That's what I've seen the most frequently, I would say.
Quick time out here. Did you know that the dojo is an incredible site with tactics, a database, a community of people trying to improve, a training program? All of this is going on at our site. So go check it out. ChessDojo.club. Hit the link in the description.
But the move bishop g5 is not without its ideas. It has a very, very clear point, even though it's moving the piece twice. It's saying black has played queen c7. So white is now threatening bishop takes f6 and then knight d5. Now black doesn't want the pawn structure damaged by g takes f6, but black also doesn't want knight d5 to make them play queen d8 again, right? If white moves the bishop twice to get it out and black moves the queen twice to return it where it started, potentially black is going to be down a tempo. So the idea is that you're kind of forcing black to play knight bd7, protecting the knight with another knight so that white won't have this free hop with knight d5. Now, why does white want the knight on d7? Because black's bishop is best placed on e6 in this line, with some exceptions, but that's sort of the main desire for black. And then the logical follow-up for white is going to be a4, preventing b5, bishop b7, which is kind of the second best option for the bishop on c8. And now it seems like black's going to be relegated, as in the game, to the third best option, which is b6, bishop to b7. Sorry, I didn't make clear that I was black in this game, but hopefully you could see it, or something about what I said made it clear. But anyway, I'm black in this game, and my opponent, their last name is David. Their first name is Alberto. They were a 2600 plus GM, which is, a fairly strong opponent for me, and I did not always fare well with black against strong grandmasters. Continuing on with the ideas of this opening, if black plays b6 and bishop b7, this is considerably worse than b5 and bishop b7. And there's two main reasons for that. Reason number one, without a pawn on b5, you're not always threatening b4. In fact, you're never threatening b4. The threat of b4 can unseat this knight and help black win the fight over e4 and d5, or improve black's chances in that fight. And the fight over the control over d5 is kind of the main thing white's going for in this opening, and black's often trying to fight against e4 to make white sort of passively defend the e-pawn. So this is kind of the pair of squares that's under debate in a vast majority of Najdorf variations. So not having b5, b4 is going to be a problem for black. And if you're going to spend a move on this pawn to develop your bishop, you'd like the pawn to also be helping your queenside play. Poking at the knight helps you fight for these two squares. It also helps you unleash pressure on the c-file. If you've got a rook on c8, you want to be able to threaten the c2 pawn with b4 to kick the knight. There's a second reason why it's disappointing to play b6, and I think I played the Najdorf for maybe 15 years before discovering this. I was always so let down not to have b5, b4, not to have my ideas, my aggressive ideas, that I would suffer somewhat in these b6 positions without ever realizing why I was suffering. And one of the main reasons you're going to suffer with b6, bishop b7 in the Najdorf is if white can put bishop and queen on e2 c4 or e2 d3 and attack that a6 pawn, your rook on a8 is going to end up often being needed to babysit the pawn on a6 instead of coming out to the c-file where, it strives for glory, or maybe rook b8 to push the b pawn forward, or even sometimes rook d8 to play d5. So for this rook to get stuck on a8, while white's pieces are kind of centralized in doing other things, is going to be very problematic for black. It's going to be a real drag on black's position. Okay, so bishop g5 with the idea of preventing bishop e6, followed by on the next move a4 with the idea of preventing b5. Yeah, this is a pretty cool idea for white, I think. And I didn't quite solve this puzzle in the game, although I half solved it. So let's see how that goes. First, the first move I played, I think, is a very nice move. It's h6, seemingly losing a tempo and mildly weakening these light squares on the king side more, which is going to be an issue because now there's one light squared pawn on the king side and 4 black squared pawns and a black squared bishop, right? But the point is this. If white took, right, it would allow me to develop this bishop to e6 again. And I don't have to spend a move on b6. So that counters out the tempo of h6, right? And so I don't have to weaken b7 and a6. And I also have the light squared bishop is going to have its presence felt still more towards the king side. So that'll make up for the downsides of h6. So, yeah, and white could retreat like this and just say, well, that wasn't a useful tempo. And maybe they should have, because I think the move they played in the game feels to me slightly dubious. But certainly if they play bishop e3, that's good news for me as well, because it means the tension's off this knight. It frees up this knight to move to b6 or c5 if I want. And again, this bishop might still be able to come out this way. So it's going to give me some other options by taking the pressure off the knight and potentially a bishop on e7. So white plays bishop h4, which I'm going to say is dubious. It's quite an unusual square for this bishop in the Najdorf. It's more of a topical discussion in Italian games these days. And like in the Italian games, the bishop's prospects are quite limited over here. And compared to the Italian games, white doesn't even have the d4 move to create some kind of latent pressure on e5 if the bishop ends up on g3. So to some extent, black could lock this bishop away on g3, and it could be pretty bad. And white will have to reroute it, which will just take some time, I guess. Black could also track it down and trade it while it's stuck on g3. And to some extent, the main prospect of this bishop is still just to trade on f6, which it just declined to do. So that might seem like, oh, you're just losing time with bishop h4 if you have to take anyway. But let's say I play b6 here, which I did, actually. b6. Even here, if white traded on f6, this would not be a huge loss of tempo, bishop h4 to h6, because black has now played b6. So bishop f6, knight f6, the bishop can no longer come to e6, right? So in a sense, it's like, strangely, all these moves are not quite losing a tempo for white or black. All these little steps back and forth with pawns and double steps with pieces. Be that as it may, I think it is a little dubious this bishop getting stuck over here, and that black could have gotten a good position right here had I, instead of b6, just thought a little bit more originally about this position. You know, I mean, I'd never faced a bishop on h4 probably in my entire Najdorf career, so this was not super on my mind. But if I just pulled the trigger on this g5 move, kicking the bishop in here and getting the move knight c5 with tempo on the pawn and letting the bishop out, and white can defend the pawn with knight d2 or bishop d3. It doesn't make a huge difference. The point is the bishop comes here. I think this would be a pleasant position for black. I actually slightly prefer black, and I think this essentially refutes the bishop g5 a4 idea, which is a perfectly fine idea. Chess is full of fine ideas that don't quite work. You know what I mean? Like, you can have an idea that's totally logical, but because of a certain detail, you find out, oh, you know, in this position, that idea doesn't work. Or in this position, this idea is super strong, like even stronger than it looks, right? And then maybe in a different position, the idea will work better or worse than it did in this position. So the idea of bishop g5 a4 to make problems for the bishop on c8, I think was a good idea, which could perhaps have worked out in this game because I played b6. But my current thinking is that this idea of h6, seemingly losing time, but white doesn't want to just release the bishop back to e6, right? My current thinking is that this h6, bishop h4, g5 essentially deals with the idea that kingside weaknesses are not a big enough problem for black when their pieces are going to be more active than white's. They're going to be able to support and justify the space that they've grabbed. Now, even that's an idea which I haven't confirmed. You know, I haven't played this position out and practiced it with strong players or, you know, analyzed it with an engine, but that's my current feeling on it. So I played b6, which, as I wrote in my annotations, to me was an apparent necessity. But in fact, it wasn't necessary. There was that g5 idea. Okay, so now I'm going to give Mr. David, not myself, but Mr. David, an exclam for knight to d2. The knight was badly placed on f3, and it's also important to start this maneuver immediately, because if white just completes development with bishop e2 or d3 and castles, the white pieces are going to be a bit passive, and black's going to start attacking the e4 pawn. Once black's attacking the e4 pawn, it might be harder for white to ever remaneuver the pieces to the more aggressive squares they want. Yeah. Okay, so white plays knight d2, and the main plan is to go bishop to c4, supported by the knight, and then queen e2, defending more light squares with the queen. We'll have that pressure against a6, and eventually, this knight is going to finish its maneuver usually through f1 and e3 a little bit later, right? So first we get bishop c4, queen e2. This is a typical maneuver that people have achieved against me in other lines in other games in the Najdorf, just not with a bishop on h4, usually with the bishop on e3. So I've seen this setup before. You go bishop c4, queen e2, and then often you sort of castle kingside, put a rook on d1, and maybe a pawn on f3, defending this pawn. And then at some point, if you can defend the bishop either by dropping it back to b3 or playing pawn to b3 or, you know, coming into d5, there's this extra maneuver, knight f1, knight e3, for complete domination of the light squares. And if white's able to complete that final stage of their maneuvers, bring the knight from d2 to e3, then usually the strategic battle is more or less won in white's favor. So I play bishop b7, right? Continuing development and putting pressure on e4. You see that black's not playing bishop e7 castles, just like white's not playing bishop e2 castles. Do you see that? So both players are prioritizing the strategic fight for these squares here, right? White wants to get in on those squares before I can defend them. I want to force white to defend the e-pawn to prevent their aggressive maneuvers. And here I think we get a real mistake from white with this move here, which is both odd and not good. But the move obviously has its idea behind it. The idea is white's overprotecting the e4 and d5 squares, right? Planning to help control f5 as well as d5 and put a knight on one of those two squares. There's some extra pressure against f6. The queen has access to the king side where I'm weak on light squares. So the move obviously makes sense, but it's a little bit awkward to be, no, it's more than a little bit awkward to be opposite this bishop. In the Najdorf, white needs to be very careful about queen f3 and when you want to do it, because in general, it's a bad relation to that bishop. So you have to make sure that you got things exactly right if you go for this as white. And most importantly, the simple move, the main move of the plan, bishop c4, simply worked and was better. And that allows you to put the queen on e2, which is slightly better than f3. And actually, I think white has the advantage if they play bishop c4. When looking over this just now, I didn't see anything in my notes indicating what I plan to do in the game. The move bishop c4 suggested. And even now looking at it, I can't suggest like anything clear that black could do to avoid white getting sort of a pleasant position here, right? With f3, the bishop can always come back, castle's kingside. I see no defects in white's position and this b6 pawn as a drag for black. Potentially my opponent didn't play bishop c4 because he was worried about / didn't calculate the move knight takes e4. And I admit that it's a little hard to evaluate the most likely continuation, not to calculate, but to evaluate, that white probably wants to take here and then here. And okay, bishop f7 is a little bit weird because this is a battle for the light squares, and I'm leading off by giving up my light squared bishop on f7 as white. But by getting rid of the f7 pawn, I weaken a lot of light squares around here, around this king. There's queen h5 and queen f3 to deal with, which could mess with how black tries to develop. The bishop on f8 has issues, but if you play g6 as black, you're going to be weak to queen f3 and white coming into f6. So I think, I think this position is good for white. I could understand maybe struggling to evaluate this position, but I think if my opponent put a lot of effort into it, he could have certainly played bishop c4 and not been too worried about knight e4. So I'm not exactly sure what happened all those years ago that made him not play the simpler move. In any case, he played the odd move, and that was all I needed to get a great game. So now I am playing as fast as possible the less exciting developing moves, bishop e7 and castles, right? I did what I could to fight for e4 immediately and to limit somewhat white's freedom to develop these pieces, and I guess maybe it worked because it scared him off of bishop c4 or something. But now I just need to finish it up. Even if the bishop does nothing here, right? I just have to finish up the development to get ready to fight. And what does fighting look like in this opening? I mean, maybe a b5 pawn break, a d5 pawn break, a rook sack on c3, something like that. Those are the three maybe most typical tools for the Najdorf player here. I might also, because this bishop, have some kind of weird knight takes e4, f5 tactic, or because the bishop's hanging on h4, I might be able to threaten something with knight e4, d5 early, based on that piece being undefended. So yeah, so that's what we're going to be looking to do as black as we speed up our development. And now white plays a too extravagant plan. He wants to bring the knight to e3 first and then put the bishop on c4, right? Because once you put the bishop on c4, it would then be harder to bring your knight to e3 because your knight's busy defending the bishop. But bishop c4 was still the better alternative. And yeah, I think black might be okay now because of this awkward queen here. Because I believe that if black castles here, black's going to be threatening this weird knight takes e4 move. And that's going to cost white a tempo. And one tempo leads to a tempo. And then, suddenly you can resist. But white plays this extravagant move. Black finishes development. And white is still 2 tempi away. It's white's move. So white's 1.5 tempi behind black. But white continues with this sort of idealized maneuver of knight e3. So now black's got 2.5 tempi on white, which is an ominous amount and definitely says black's going to be able and ready to do something here. So to me, white's best move is bishop d3. Obviously, that's not congruent with the plan, right? If you've played knight c4, it was not to play bishop d3 or bishop e2 or something here. And I'm sure black would be fine. I think after bishop d3, black can probably still play this classic Sicilian break with d5, just the same. But in the game, white plays knight e3. And so now white is threatening to put the knight on f5, potentially, with some issues for me on the king side. Or just to play bishop c4 and totally lock down the d5 square. So I'm possibly one move away from busted here, actually. And white has played true to this bishop e3, knight f3 positional line against the Najdorf, right? Long minor piece maneuvers. Normally you think in the Najdorf of black being behind in development for positional advantages, like the c file and the extra pawn in the center. Here, white has spent so much time trying to take advantage of some positional weaknesses for black in this positional line that black is way ahead in development, and it's time for black to strike. And so here, maybe the most typical blow of the entire Sicilian defense is when black's able to play d5 and eliminate white's e4 pawn and, gain space for all their pieces. And black plays it here straight into the square that white has controlled the most on the entire board, right? And what a difference the pawn sack makes for this bishop. I guess you could think of that partly as a clearance sacrifice, right? If white gets a piece to d5, that guy is buried. You get rid of your own pawn first. Even if white gets d5, at least your guy can come out. And white's been so concentrated on this light square that their dark squares in this area of the board are not good at all, right? This bishop's over here because it had threatened to take the knight to increase light square control. Both knights are on dark squares to control light squares, which means they can be targets, but they're not defending the dark squares. So this guy's going to be, he's the happiest. This bishop on e7 is the happiest about d5, but all the black pieces are going to rejoice, right? The bishop is going to say, okay, maybe I got some chances to talk. And the c and d files could become more important with this sacrifice. So, yeah, black's good. And now basically the game is going to be almost 80% just a chunk of variations and calculations. So, if the long maneuvering stuff was not your cup of tea, now is your moment. And if your eyes glaze over when there's variations, I'm sorry, but this is the reality. You can make long, beautiful maneuvers where if your opponent sits around, you eventually get every piece to nice squares. But strong players are going to play unexpected pawn sacks to really change the dynamics of your games. So be prepared. White plays in the game knight c takes d5, which avoids bishop b4 pinning the knight where it stands, right, and putting pressure on the knight. So I guess the most simple move might be pawn takes d5, right, and then the bishop comes to b4, and you can see why the bishop wants to be there. Before we get to that, though, just in order of the variations, let's look at knight f5. White ignores the whole thing and just says, hey, I'm fast enough on my attacks. I think bishop b4 is the only move, but it's a very good one. After queen g3 going for mate, We're just going to go knight h5, knight h6, check, king h7 doesn't help white. So here, check, here, check, here, knight f4. And this is going to allow black to take the rook with check and then defend the mate in some way or other, I suppose, just at some point g6, letting white get this pawn. And black's up a rook. Okay. So that's knight f5. Then there is e takes d5, bishop b4. If bishop c4 trying to defend the d5 square, black just breaks with b5. If you save the bishop, then you get broken on c3, and there's king e2. You don't lose a rook, but black's obviously for choice, as they're going to be attacking the white king in the middle of the board and not even be down anything. Another option is to now go knight f5, and I thought e4 would be good for black here, but it's surprisingly not. So better is bishop takes d5, just kicking the queen, and then g6. If white goes knight h6, king h7, the knight's just kind of bad over on h6. And let's just survey the position, right? I mean, white's development is bad. Black's pieces are all on pretty awesome squares, pretty well coordinated. And black's center is better than white's. So it's just a terrible position for white, Nothing else too much to say, right? We regained the pawn sack and everything's good. So white played knight cd5 to avoid that bishop b4. And now I traded the bishop. Sometimes the bishop's a more valuable piece than a knight, very often. But in the Najdorf, it's kind of 50-50 how you take on d5. Honestly, sometimes you need to preserve your light squared bishop to cover your weak light squares, because your opponent's going to have a pawn on d5 often. And so your light squares may need defense. Other times you need the knight because it's immediately got some punchy possibilities over on the king side. It really depends. Here, the choice can also be made very easily tactically, because if black takes with the knight, it simply loses to knight d5, hitting queen and bishop, bishop d5, bishop e7. So if this bishop escapes, white wins in exchange. And if black continues trying to keep the pieces equal with rook e8, there's this little move at the end, which attacks all three of white's heavy pieces and ends the game. So knight d5 was a big no-no, but in any case, bishop d5 is what I want to do here, actually. This is a position where the knights pack enough punch, and specifically after e d5, you'll see that the move e4 that I mentioned is important, but I'll explain why in a moment. Right now, it's not really obvious whether e4 is a good or bad move. First, we've got to start with bishop b4 check. In basically all variations, whether the knight's on c3 or not, this is the key move that starts black's counterplay, and basically it's around, keeping the white king from castling. And then this king side is going to be a little slow to untangle and coordinate, and that's going to be ample compensation for one pawn, right? So c3, bishop takes c3 check is a pretty simple tactic. Queen c3 would win that rook, right? So white's just forced to displace the king. He goes to d1 instead of e2, so the bishop could come out, right? King e2, it's not even clear what white would want to play next move. Now, it's very important that here black think about what white wants to play next move. We've sacked a pawn, and the king's in the center, and, you don't have to be a grandmaster or a Paul Morphy or anything to see that there's, a reasonable plan of attacking white's king in the middle of the board. You've got two potential open files to bring your rooks to attack this king. And, and you're ahead in development and there's lots of pieces on the board. Okay, it could be pretty simple. We could play, rook c8 or rook d8 and leave no comment, right? But it's actually very important to play the best move for black here. And I think it can only be found by thinking about what white wants to do. What does white want to do? What gives them a fighting shot in this game? They want to move this bishop on f1 to either d3 or c4. Then they want to play king e2 and rook h to d1. If white achieves those things, they could be pretty confident in the position. So what black is going to start off with here is kind of a prophylaxis. We're going to take these two squares away from this bishop with tempo, right? e4, boom. Popping the queen. She heads over to h3. Going to g3 doesn't really help in any particular way because black can just play bishop d6. The bishop's not needed on b4 particularly at the moment, so it wouldn't really change anything. You'll see the bishop on b4 you'll understand as you see more of the game. It's not particularly helpful there. It mostly just gets captured. It was important to keep the white king from castling, right? But now the bishop's done its job. So e4, queen went to h3, and now b5. And now we've taken both squares away from the bishop. So now the bishop could come to e2, but that doesn't create a way to castle by hand, right? There's still not enough room to castle by hand after bishop e2. Most important little tactical detail. It's not hard to calculate why white can't take this pawn. The important thing is just having your mind open to we want to play these moves that stop the bishop. And once you ask yourself, can we play b5, then you can calculate it pretty easily. But sometimes your mind just won't let you consider a move like b5 because we've just given up our light squared bishop and we don't control that square. And our mind might just be on developing the rooks. But what we're doing here for black with e4 and b5 is much stronger than developing the rooks, actually. Here's the variation for anyone who wants to see it. The rook on a1's hanging, right? Takes. And now if white takes the second pawn, rook a1 check is going to win the rook on h1. But even if white doesn't take on b5, rook a1 check is going to be a killer move, next move anyway, right? Right now it would be king e2, rook e1 mate. So, yeah, rook a1 is going to be destruction in a moment, one way or another. So white did not take on b5, and they played g4. And I think this is a perfectly reasonable, practical try. I have no idea what the computer's best suggestion for white would be here. But what you can see is this move makes some space for the two pieces that are problematic, right? There's maybe rook g1, maybe bishop g2, maybe bishop e2 with rook g3 or something, so there's a little more room for those two pieces. Plus, under the right circumstances, g5 could create counterplay for white if black dilly-dallies a little bit. And that's all it takes for a 2600 GM, right? Like if you waste one move doing something imprecise with black, like maybe you put your rook on e8 when it should have gone to d8, or maybe you play knight e5, just putting your knight on a pretty square when you needed to first play, rook c8 and make an actual threat. That's all it takes. They play g5, and then even if the position might still be good for black, it's just become practically too complicated, right? Now you're forced to get into calculating 20 variations with a 2600 GM, and some of them work and some of them don't, and, hey, comebacks happen, and that's where it starts. So in a sense, this is practical because it's got this option of really complicating matters if black isn't really precise and aggressive with the time that they used. But in this game, I was, so you won't really see the plus side of g4 and how, practically speaking, if Grandmaster David had played this move against 20 players rated 2400, he might have saved 7 of those 20 games in ways that would be heartbreaking for those 20 other for those black players, but it happens. Anyway, now that we've prevented this bishop from coming out, now we need to rush the rooks into the game. That becomes the most pressing thing. So we go rook c8, right? Preparing a threat against c2. And basically the threat is, like, if white goes rook g1 or g5 or something, you play knight takes d5, right? Because that knight is covering c2 and d5. And then you're even going to have knight takes e3 with check. So you're threatening to take on c2 with check and mate. So the threats come very quickly from black in this case. Okay, so white plays c3 to avoid knight d5, queen c2, sort of the double threat. And here again, we could spend a move saving the bishop. C5 doesn't look that bad. We could take out that knight and try and get our pawn back. Could also develop the rook to d8 to just get all your firepower. But like I told you, the difference between rook e8, rook d8, you play the wrong tempo, could really be an issue, and the rook would be opposite this bishop. So black has to be even more precise here, and this, I think, is the grandest of the moves here for black. Recalling a quote from one of my favorite chess players and writers, Mikhail Tal, who said they can only take them one at a time. So there they are. They're hanging. White can only take them one at a time. The variations, I remember during the game that the variations felt a little confusing and challenging to me during this game. In analysis at home, I didn't really feel that. So I don't know how awesome or impressive or whatever this game is going and its calculations are going to seem to you now. During the game, I remember being impressed with myself when I finally got a handle on them because I wasn't confident in them. And when I was going over my notes and analysis, I remember feeling not impressed by it. Like, well, yeah, it's only a few variations that are really critical and they're not that long. But there's something really confusing about calculating this over the board for me. And I only say this because I know this is part of this series of, games that have been rated by Kostya, Jesse, and Sam. So we might be thinking in terms of like, is this really that great or whatever? So anyway, I had a very distinctly different impression during the game that the calculation was difficult, and then during analysis that it was like, oh, sort of clear, CB4, Queen D6 transposes to, Knight D5, Queen D6, CB4 or whatever, But I'll just take you through a couple key variations. So if white had played CB4, I would play Queen D6. The queen gets to the file better than the rook, even though she's on the file with this rook already. She comes here, and now we're threatening knight f4 check to win the queen, as well as knight takes knight, double check, etc. King e2, there's still knight f4, and king e1 is met by queen b4 check, right? And the king doesn't have any territory to run, still no king e2. So basically, there's no choice here but to take the knight, right? And then we go check, and now you can see, okay, the king's kind of cut off. There's only so many variations. And when the king steps aside to e1, I guess e2 is even worse because of rook c2, right? So let's go to e1. Then black's gonna have this simple move e3, threatening to win a queen or deliver checkmate. And yeah, that's winning. So white played knight d5, and then I played queen d6. So now you'll recognize that cb4, queen d5 check, and e3 transposes to the line you've just seen. So the only other alternative here for white is at this point to start moving the king. So he plays king e1. I gave it an exclam. I don't know especially why, but okay, we'll give him an exclam. Queen takes d5. So now again, c takes b4, e3. That's a variation we know, right? So let's see, what were the alternatives here? I guess rook to d1 is an alternative, and maybe queen to e3. See what the notes give. Rook to d1. And now this was a variation that I remember was challenging for me during the game because the pieces are still hanging, right? And I wasn't sure which way to go with this. It took me a while to find the variation. I think queen b3 might be the only really good move here. And then there's two different pieces white can take. If rook takes d7, queen b2. So now it's disastrous for white to let this pawn drop, especially because black would take with the rook and win the queen. She couldn't get out in time, so there's no time for bishop g2, king f1 or anything. So white has to take it, check here. And in this position, I didn't find the fastest win during the game. I missed the following idea of check here, threatening mate on c1, queen e3, and then rook c2. I think this is what I didn't see from afar. It looks like black's almost like run out of pieces, right? And what can you do with just two pieces, right? White's got a queen and some bishops covering squares. But actually after this, they just can't stop queen b1. Once you see rook c2, it's kind of simple, but from a few moves before, and remember I'm calculating all of this before I played rook c8. So to explain my time usage and how I play chess to you all. I knew what I was doing with e4 and b5, but I didn't know for sure what white would play in this position where they played g4, right? I didn't know if they would play g4, bishop e2, c3, what. So once they played g4, this is where I thought for a long time. And so when I'm playing rook c8, I'm calculating how am I going to deal with c3? Oh, I'm going to play knight d5? Okay, what am I going to do there after cb4 or knight d5 or queen d6 and king e1? So all the variations we're talking about, my way of playing chess is to sink into a huge think here and think for probably 30, 40 minutes on rook c8 and find at least promising lines against all of this. And I remember that at that point, it was very hard for me to evaluate, to go through this position here. So what I had found was queen b4 check in this position, driving the king up, rook c2, king e3. And even this was like, very, very big struggle for me to visualize. And you don't have to figure out every detail once you've convinced yourself that something's promising, right? That's an important thing to realize. So once we got here, I realized like there's going to be something good enough for me. I was thinking probably rook c3, bishop d3, rook e8. I know I'm recovering one of the pieces. I know the king's a mess. I know I'm up a couple pawns. So, I didn't go through every detail. I saw there's other options from here probably, right? So that's that rook d7 line. And here there's this checkmate that I didn't conceive of in the game. The other line is they take the bishop. Take the bishop. And then check. Here, check. Here, check. Here, check. And in this position, a beautiful move, rook f1. If white takes with the rook, then queen d3 check wins the queen. But it's even worse if white takes with the queen, because then she doesn't cover f3. And black has queen d3 check, king f4, queen d3 checkmate. So, yeah. Bishop e2, by the way, black could play something like queen c5 check, checking the king to get off of the bishop, and then just rook takes h1, taking white's rook. So, yeah. All the lines are sound here, and this queen b3 is a very, very nice move, I think. So in the game, after queen d5, my opponent plays bishop g2, making some space for the king to run as it's getting hot for him, and he doesn't want to be hanging out in the center anymore. I think there's probably, a million winning moves here for black, and, maybe you could win with bishop c5 or something, right? Why not? Then you've got equal material in a great position. Note that white can never castle because the king's moved. If they could castle, this might be all very competitive after they castle. But as long as they can't castle, they don't have enough time to really get back into this game here. But nevertheless, I think this move looks the most logical and powerful to me. We just bring the next piece into the fray. We're not yet sure how we're using this rook, but this knight is going to be felt on d3 or f3. And also now it's not hanging to, rook d1 kind of move, so at least I can stop losing the piece and instead using it. So yeah, white now finally took this piece sacrifice over here. They could also, keep running with the king. Then I was thinking bishop c5, rook e1, knight f3, something like this. And basically the rook on h1 never gets out, right? So it's lost. There's no way to ever get it out. Eventually, the black rooks are going to challenge the white rook, and then there will be back rank mate or something with the rook still on h1, which is kind of how the game goes. Another candidate move for white, maybe queen e3, and I don't remember anymore what I was planning. It's not written in my old notes. Between rook e8 or knight f3. I don't know which one I was going to do, but I think they're both easily winning. Here's an example of one of them. Rook e8, king f1, knight f3, takes here, takes here. And yeah, I just don't see these pieces ever getting fixed. And so the black extra rook essentially is going to win the middle game battle. So the denouement of the game, white took the piece finally. Black checks here. If king f1, queen d3 is checkmate. So white has to take it. Oop. Takes. And to me, this is like an important detail. This pawn, when it gets promoted from like a nice center pawn to a pawn on f3, it becomes an extra attacker. In my opinion, you get a pawn on f3, f6, g3, that kind of square, somewhere on the third rank, a step or a step away from the king or on the same file as the king. That's an extra attacker in your attack. So just in general, that's a very powerful tool to have in your attacking kit. Here, it's basically going to be attacking by creating false back rank mates. It also could be a positional way of winning the game if you sort of just trapped the rook on h1 and then took your time winning elsewhere. But here, yeah, it just comes very quickly. The king. So, yes, I call this pawn on f3 the nail in the coffin. And here the king heads off to seek safety inside the coffin. So now I just get the last rook from f8 into the game. Prepare rook c1. Here's my last variation for you folks. In the game, he plays h3. After rook d1, you can go trade. Or rook c1, I guess. Doesn't matter. Rook c1, rook d2, check. Here, back rank mate. So that was kind of like the last thing that I had to see when I was putting the queen on d2 and doubling rooks, was that this rook d1 move, I could just take it or play rook c1 here. So h3 is played in the game. Then rook c1 wins the queen. White finally gets the rook on the correct side of the king. Queen b4 is a lot better than queen b2 because if white defends this b2 pawn, the rook on b1 will be worse with a b2 pawn than a b4 pawn. And white resigned here. It's not much of an endgame to play out. Black can finish things quickly with f5 and g5 playing against this bishop, right? And then f4 or something. Plus black's already ahead material. So that was the game. And you can see that once my opponent played a little too ambitiously with the opening maneuver, trying to gain a big positional advantage, and I played d5, the game's just straight on from there. Black's got the initiative, and white just gets beaten like a drum. There's not really any moment where white could swing the feeling of the game, change who's got the initiative, sack in exchange for a pawn for counterplay. It's just a straight up drubbing. So a reminder to be careful about long maneuvers and leaving the king in the center. All right. I hope that you enjoyed that game. I certainly have. 100 times or more in my life, I play through this game now and then. It's on my playlist, my happy playlist. And if you've got any questions about anything that wasn't clear, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to rectify that. All right, cheers.